Hello, good evening. Welcome, everyone. Just bear with your screens for just a moment. It's gonna get big as I share my slides for you. Just a few things up top, some of which we've already mentioned, just so we're all on the same page for the rest of this wonderful evening. Welcome. You're here on the Zoom. So step one, complete. You logged in. Hopefully, you're able to see everyone, hear everyone properly. Just to double check, make sure your microphone is muted. Of course, eventually we'd love to hear your voice as you ask the author's questions in the Q&A portion, but for now, please do make sure it's muted if it's not already. Video, as mentioned before, is welcome. Certainly if it's something you'd prefer not to, you can definitely keep it off, but we'd always love to see your wonderful face if you are okay with that. You can also change the name, of course, on your. Eventually, we'd love to hear your voice as you ask if you are okay with that. Sorry, I'm hearing a bit of an echo somewhere, so I don't know if someone wants to say. Okay, there we go. Well, where was I? Oh yeah, you can edit your name on your screen if you'd like to. Again, this just helps during the Q&A portion to make sure we are referring to you in the way that you'd like to be referred. So just make sure that the name on your screen is the way that, that you'd like to be called on when the portion comes around. And then, of course, yeah, the chat is there. So feel free to introduce yourself. Some of you have done that already, and please continue to do so. Feel free to use it throughout the program portion as the authors are speaking. You know, feel free to react, vibe, compliment, comment on the things that are being said. I'm sure lots of wonderful intelligent things will indeed be said. And then, yes, lastly, this reading will be recorded for future posting online. So if there's something that you missed or you want to revisit later on, this will show up on our YouTube channel. We're going to do a little bit of housekeeping up top before I throw it over to the actual people you're here to listen to. Carla, would you like to take it from here, or?
Yes, I'm just going to talk while Aditya plays some slides, but good evening, good people. Welcome to the 19th annual CityLit Festival. Do you know how good it feels to say that? The 19th. We are winning on that tip alone, aren't we? My name is Carla Dupre, the Executive Director of CityLit Project located in Baltimore, Maryland. Before we begin tonight's session, I'd like to acknowledge the land that surrounds us is part of who we are. It reflects our histories. We are currently on the traditional lands of the Piscataway people who have stewarded throughout generations. To make this a more meaningful practice, if you live in this region, we respectfully ask you to consider learning more about the Piscataway Kanoi tribe, the people where the rivers blend, and to invest energy in learning more about the land buyback movement for tribal nations. Every community owes its existence and vitality to generations from around the world who contributed their energy to making the history that led to this moment. Some were brought here against their will, some were drawn to leave their distant homes in the hope of a better life, and some have lived on this land for more generations than can be counted. We acknowledge we are standing on ancestral lands, and we honor the thousands of enslaved Africans whose lives were physically and spiritually stolen. We pay respect to the elders, past and present. CityLit would also like to acknowledge the long toil of this pandemic, where we have experienced loss on a grand scale, and where now our nations or several nations are at war. I happen to believe, along with many others, that when one nation is at war in so many ways, we all are. We will keep Ukraine in our hearts and pray for their safety, their spirited hope, and their well-being. Long before we begin tonight's session, lastly, before we begin tonight's session, where we launch our 19th festival, people, we at CityLit would like to take a moment to acknowledge a woman who was a champion of the literary arts, in particular, a champion of CityLit Project, from the seeds of it, long into the birth and growth of it. Last week, CityLit founder Greg Wilhelm lost his mother, Joan Higdon Wilhelm, who will always be a light that glows within CityLit. Her support over the years, even during our transition with me on board, felt so much like a spiritual nod to doing this good work, as if she and Mr. Wilhelm were saying, keep making CityLit shine and find your way to glow. We are glowing, Mrs. Joan Wilhelm. Thank you for lighting the path for us to glow. Now let's get to business. It is no surprise our festival theme is how we break free, confronting hard truths. We couldn't sugarcoat the last 3 years, even if we wanted to, could we? We couldn't act like we were good and living, thriving really, when the brunt of a pandemic fell on us like a rude awakening, unlike anything we could ever believe claimed so many lives and burdened our spirits. We purposely created a theme for this year's festival that is embedded in every session held: how we break free from things we find useless, from toxicity that clouds our judgment, from literary work we create that doesn't serve us. How do we break free from that? How we break free from years of a history that left out a few facts that would change the way we viewed slavery. All these years and the risk is really, all these years and the risk we really take is not knowing. We like to say, if you're looking for small talk, talk that doesn't make you squirm a little in your seat, you haven't been to CityLit. If you don't walk away questioning your journey through this thing we call life, you surely haven't been to CityLit. But if you're here to listen and learn a thing or two, if you're here to take in words and revelations of the remarkable poets and writers and graphic authors we place in front of you, then you came to the right place. Take a seat, lean into all that's possible. And for good measure, let me say, there's a reason to celebrate tonight too. This year, CityLit has forged incredible new partnerships with the following organizations to bring the light of literature to your living rooms, through your screens, and in a few weeks, to the Central Pratt Library, the Motor House, and at Busboys and Poets. We can't begin to believe our good luck, but we can thank the generosity of these organizations and people who spirited and elevate literature in the best of ways. CityLit thanks Maryland Centers for Creative Classrooms, Maryland Humanities, Arts Education in Maryland Schools, Motor House, Greater Baltimore Cultural Alliance, Busboys and Poets in Baltimore, Bmore Art Magazine, the Ivy Bookshop, Joyful Signing, with two wonderful people joining us tonight, Jeremy Brunson and Derek Kenyon from Joyful Signing. And a huge thank you to our graphic design team at Inside 180, a small women-owned business in Ellicott City, who make sure we leave the house with our hair looking pretty. We also thank Enoch Pratt Free Library, where we will hold 4 of our festival sessions that will include Nicole Hannah-Jones, creator of the 1619 Project. Most importantly, CityLit is forever thankful for the many, and I do mean many, funders who held us up these past 2 years, who allowed us to do the undoable and to keep the spirit of poetry and literature alive and at our fingertips. We couldn't do Lit without them. And real talk, I couldn't do Lit without my family who puts up with me during festival season, and my CityLit team of boss people, and I will name them: Dana Harris Travado, chair; Brian Lyles, immediate past chair; Chelsea Lemon-Fetzer, vice chair; Aditya Desai, secretary; Bunky Markert, a treasure of a treasure; our brand spanking new board member, Tracy Diamond; and our incredible baptism by festival fire, Joe Massa. Okay, we're here to talk about navigating solitude, how we did it, how we fared and didn't fare, how introverts might love it and extroverts only sometimes crave it. Joining us to moderate this conversation is Nguyên Khôi Nguyễn, a multidisciplinary artist and educator. He's the cartoonist of the Ignatz nominated comic series, The Gall. Nguyen's work has been featured in The New Yorker, Smithsonian Asian Pacific American Center, and Medium. He is the vocalist pianist of the jazz trio Superior Clean and creator of Mom's Viet Kitchen, a cooking website that shares family recipes and the stories behind them. When Curly writes and draws in Our Own Time, a recurring webcomic for McSweeney's that charts the ups and downs of his and his wife's fertility journey. As a 2021 Ruby's Artist Grantee, he is working on a graphic memoir chronicling life during the pandemic. Nguyen is a digital media lecturer at Loyola University in Maryland. He lives in Baltimore and recently won a whopping $10,000 from the Maryland State Arts Council for his literary genius. Please show some love for Nguyên Khôi Nguyễn.
Thanks, everybody. Is that my cue, Carla? Ready to go?
Yes, that is your cue to take it away.
Yeah, that was very kind of you. Thank you so much. And I'm so lucky to spend this evening with everyone, especially with the authors. Tonight, we're talking with Natalie Eve Garrett and Kristen Radke about their new books. I have them right here. They've been my February companions. And so first of all, I just want to say thank you to you both for giving me a great read all through February and helping me get through what I think is the loneliest month of the year. I think February, no one names their kid February. It's a rough month. So I'm just going to start off with the introduction of the authors, and then we'll get right into the conversation. So first off, Natalie Eve Garrett is an artist and writer. She's the editor of Eat Joy, a collection of personal stories with recipes exploring how comfort food helps us cope in dark times. She is also the editor of the Artists and Writers Cookbook. A graduate of Yale University and the University of Pennsylvania's School of Design, Natalie lives with her husband and 2 children outside DC along the Potomac River. Natalie, can you give us a brief description of your forthcoming book, The Lonely Stories?
Sure. So The Lonely Stories is a collection of personal essays from 22 celebrated writers exploring the joys and the struggles of being alone. Shall I leave it at that? We can dig in more.
Yeah, we'll dig in more, yeah.
Great.
Next, Kristen Radke is a writer and illustrator based in Brooklyn, New York. Her graphic memoir, Imagine Wanting Only This, was described by The Atlantic as a breathtaking mix of prose and illustration. She earned her MFA from the University of Iowa's nonfiction writing program. Radke's writing and comics have appeared in the New York Times, the New York Times Magazine, Harper's, and many more. She's the art director of The Verge. Kristen, can you give us a brief description of your new book, CQ?
Yeah, so CQ, thank you also, Wynn, for doing this and for all. I know it's a lot of work to prep all of this. So actually thanks to everyone, because this is definitely a labor of love. So very grateful. So CQ, A Journey Through American Loneliness, is a graphic nonfiction book that explores loneliness in America in terms of how we perceive it in terms of science and also popular culture and interpersonally, things like that.
Great. So the title of this conversation, as Carla said, is Navigating Solitude. This is such a resonant topic, I think, for all of us. It's a universal issue that we're all dealing with during the pandemic. It's kind of amplified, right? So Kristen, my first question is for you. I thought that the way you define loneliness was so beautiful in CQ. Could you share that definition and then talk about how you came across it?
Sure. So, I mean, I think a lot of definitions for loneliness, but I think one of them, an easy way to explain it is sort of that loneliness is the gap between the relationships that you have and the relationships that you want. So it's like that space there. So it really has nothing to do with the amount of friends you have, with like how great and active your family is. It's just everyone has kind of a different threshold for how much loneliness they can tolerate, and you can feel kind of that sense of dissatisfaction even if you do have a really engaged community.
And was that the definition from the researcher? Was it Capioco, or was that from somewhere?
Yeah. So that's sort of the general concept. So I think one of the things that scientists try to do, so the study of loneliness is quite new. We've really only looked at loneliness since the 70s. And since we looked at it, we realized how damaging and dangerous it is for our health and for the health of our communities too. But one of the things I think that is really important when we're talking about loneliness, and that has been important in science, is to define the difference between solitude and loneliness, because those things loneliness really has nothing to do with the amount of time you spend alone. You know, you can be quite lonely and spend all your time with other people, and you can rarely see other people and feel socially fulfilled.
Yeah. And so, Natalie, your collection of stories, every single one of those authors has this relationship with solitude versus loneliness. Can you talk about that? Did that come organically? Did they just submitted manuscripts to you and it turned out that way, or was always kind of a part of the plan for Lonely Stories?
I mean, I definitely wanted a range, and I gave ideas for things that I hoped someone would touch on, but I wanted it to, even though it's called The Lonely Stories, I definitely wanted it to encompass all different sort of facets and permutations of being alone, including joy and solitude, and how solitude can be replenishing and healing. And So yeah, I mean, I felt like sometimes I maybe nudge things more in one direction or another. And I also feel like it was really important to me that the book kind of tease out the distinction between the two, because as Kristen was saying, you know, they're so different. Like I think of loneliness as, you know, being defined by lack, whereas solitude to me is kind of the art of feeling at ease or like at home within oneself. There's a quote from May Sarton that I really like that a friend just reminded me of yesterday, that loneliness is the poverty of self and solitude is richness of self. And I feel like that really nicely kind of addresses the paradox of how, you know, being alone can be both maddening and joyful. And I hope that's something that really comes through in the book, because we're all at once kind of inextricably alone within ourselves, and yet also kind of capable of feeling utterly at home within ourselves.
So, Kristen, you had this incredible balancing act with including memoir, research, a bit of history, and then trying to juxtapose the visuals, the drawings with a pretty dense amount of text, which is always kind of the struggle of like a cartoonist, is how much text and how much visuals.
Yeah, one of the struggles, I would say,
right.
At least for me.
Yeah, and so I was wondering, did you have like some guiding principles early on that to keep you on track and to make sure that this thing wouldn't get too unwieldy? And it's such a rich experience reading the book, and I think it's just right. But wow, that balancing act.
Yeah, not really. I didn't really set rules for myself. I mean, I would rather have, I guess to me, I would rather have an unwieldy project in the beginning and then whittle it down, because to me, there's nothing worse than having nothing. Like, I'd rather have like 10,000 garbage pages than like 2 good pages, because you can winnow that, you know, it's like, there's, I like to have more to work with. But so one of the things with this book isn't in traditional panels. It doesn't look like a traditional comic. The pages are like a lot more organic in shape. And that was quite freeing to me. And I don't really remember how that came to be. It just sort of came out when I was drawing. And that gave me a lot of flexibility in the way that I could use a page in the way that was a little trickier when I was working in a more traditional comics format. And I mean, I still love reading comics like that. Like, those are probably my favorite kinds of graphic novels. It just didn't really feel like it served this project, because this isn't a project full of characters. It's like a more idea driven and research driven book.
Yeah.
So that format, I think, kind of helped give me some space. But in terms of rules, I think one of the things, I think every artist has to kind of figure this out for themselves, what their rule is for what they draw and what they write. But my rule is sort of like, if I can put it in a drawing, I put it in a drawing rather than writing it. And over time, I think I pare back a lot of the words, because sometimes maybe it'll be redundant with the image or things like that. But I think once, as you move back and forth between the drawing and the writing, one medium changes the other one a little bit. I think if you're going to do it right, otherwise, kind of what's the point of doing them both together? So I try to move back and forth and kind of let them be in conversation with each other.
And you have an editor that I guess I'm curious about, did the editor push you to have less text or more visuals, or one or the other, or?
Not really. I mean, I think it was definitely a collaborative process. I always needed a good editor. I'm definitely not someone who can like churn out a great draft on my own. I just need some reinforcement. I think it's one of the reasons that I do very badly when I'm lonely, is I just need someone to bounce an idea off of, to know even what I think.
Yeah.
And I felt really bad about that for a long time. Like, it made me like less of an artist or something like that. But I think it made me less sure of who I am. But I also think one of the things I relish now about my relationships is that I feel only really fully realized through my relationships with other people. And it's just interesting to hear somebody else's ideas and the way they think through the kind of the problems that you're having in a creative project, because I never really know what the biggest problems are until I put it in front of someone else. It's like I try to take it as far as I can on my own, but that's only so far.
Yeah, and as a cartoonist, it's like, oh my gosh, I just inked all this, and
yeah, that's rough. That's definitely rough. Although I don't mind throwing things away. Like that's something I've kind of gotten over. Like if it's in service of something else, I'm fine with that.
Yeah.
I mean, if it's okay, I'm actually curious of what that process is like for Natalie as an editor.
Oh, I thought you were going to say as a visual artist.
And as a visual artist too.
But I don't do visual books, or I don't yet. I haven't figured out how to negotiate that yet in my life. But what the process is like as an editor working with, or what the exchange is like, or
yeah, I mean, like because in a certain way, like in your anthologies, all of the stories are in conversation with each other, and then also with your mind as an editor.
No, it's true. Also, I was just thinking about what you were saying about really relishing feedback from your editor, because and how like you would feel sort of lonely or bereft without it, because I really feel like working on this, because most of the Lonely Stories was born, I mean, I actually sold the book before the pandemic, so it was not a pandemic idea, but most of it was born during the pandemic, mostly during 2020 actually. And I mean, it made the pandemic so much less lonely for me to be working with all of these extraordinary people and the relationships I forged. I mean, I feel really lucky that, you know, I can call some of these people my dear friends now. You know, I'm like texting at night, and it's the loveliest thing. But not only, you know, the bonds with those people, but also like I feel like that kind of, you know, compassionate exchange and in many cases friendship. I hope it feels like it's sort of interwoven into the stories too, because a lot of time when you're telling stories that are so personal, it's strange to tell that to someone who you don't yet have a rapport with. And so I felt like almost it went like in tandem, the relationship and the story, and then the unfurling process. And I mean, some of them I admit came to me, and I was like, you know, it was, you know, I mean, there was, you know, little things here and there, massaging, but or reordering is a thing that I tend to do. but others, it was really an unfurling of narrative, which for me is my favorite. It's so moving to be a part of that and to have a writer let me experience that with them, and, you know, help tease out something that becomes increasingly intimate. I don't know, I just feel very lucky to be able to have done that.
It's funny that you just used the word intimate, because that's what I was thinking when you were talking, when you're talking about how you developed these relationships so quickly, which is like how human beings bond with each other, is by disclosing things to each other. So it's so cool.
Yeah, that's true.
So Natalie, you've got this amazing like all-star roster of writers for this collection, and it's such an interesting choice, right, to have writers not come up with fictional characters talking about loneliness, but having the writers themselves talk about their experiences with loneliness. So can you talk about that decision, or was that always the plan? Because writers do have a unique perspective on loneliness.
True, because so much of the craft is, you know, I mean, art making in general is often, I mean, I guess theater is private and public, but I mean, so much of the process is kind of cloistered. So yeah, it was always my intention to have it be personal stories as opposed to fictional stories. I actually didn't really, I don't know, I didn't consider that. It just felt like, I feel like telling personal stories, there's something so, I'm using the word intimate tonight apparently, but there's something so intimate about that. And you know, especially when talking about something like loneliness, which can be so heartbreaking, I feel like, talking about it is sort of the opposite. It's like, this heart expanding process. And I also think, I don't know, for me, working on this book during the pandemic, during like this incredibly lonely for various reasons, there was sort of it was lonely, and then also there was this dearth of solitude that I experienced as, a mother who's cloistered, with my whole family. But I realized that actually the lack of solitude is also in a way a kind of loneliness as well, because you become disconnected from yourself. But working on the book, I really felt like was kind of this joyful portal for me. And in the sense that like, it was sort of like a stepping stone to the kind of joy that comes from feeling relieved. Like, oh, hey, like I'm not the only one who feels this way. And I think that's what stories, can do, and art can do, is, remind us that you're not alone in feeling however you're feeling. It's such an unlonely and moving thing, I think.
How about for the both of you, just thinking about solitude and loneliness. There's this section that you talk about I think it's in the Lonely Stories, where Anthony Doerr talks about how technology is in his case kind of hindering his ability to be present. But then, Kristen, your book has sort of this ambivalence towards technology, that it does positive things and it does some negative things in terms of the way we deal with loneliness. Can you guys, either one of you or both of you, talk about that?
Yeah, Natalie, I'd love to hear your thoughts on that. I do feel I think technology is a tool, like a computer is a tool, the internet is a tool, and we can use or misuse tools just like any other tool. So I think it's up to us to use them responsibly, and also to be aware of how they might be impacting us or changing the way that we relate to the world. But during the pandemic, I watched, friends and family members of mine who have, mobility issues or something like that, suddenly have their worlds really open up to them, because so many more people were doing things like this online. And suddenly they were offered a seat at that table in a way that maybe was not available to them before. So I do think it's really important that we not like whole scale say technology is isolating us from one another, because while that might be a personal experience, it's not necessarily the same for everyone. But I definitely think about teenagers now and think about how different their lives are than when I was sort of trying to figure out who I was. And I think it definitely remains to be seen what impact that will have on their ability to kind of form long-term social relationships. But I try to be careful about doomsdaying about it, because throughout history, basically every new technological wave is met with like, this is the end of everything. Like we thought that about the train, about the telephone, about the radio, and we're still, the telephone connected us more than we'd ever had been before. And at the time it was, I wrote this in the book, but the New York Times wrote this like scathing editorial about the telephone that said something like, "We will soon become nothing but transparent heaps of goo to each other," which is an amazing line. It's probably the best line that's ever been in the New York Times. But I love the New York Times, but it's a great line. And of course, that turned out not to be true at all. So I think, I don't know, I think a lot of it remains to be seen, but I'm curious what you think, Natalie.
No, I completely agree, and I love what you said. I'm grateful that you acknowledge, that of course it can function as both. I mean, far be it from me to argue with Tony Doerr, and it's his personal experience. And I love, I love the essay he wrote. It's funny, it's heartwarming, it's moving. I couldn't love it more. But actually, I might be mistaken, but I think it's one of the few times that technology does come up in the book. So I'm grateful to include it. But yeah, I absolutely feel like you know, of course, for so many disabled people, you know, technology is, you know, a lifeline and, you know, crucial means of connection. And I mean, I certainly, like, you know, of course, experienced a facet of that during the pandemic. And then, you know, at the same time, there's the days where, or the years where it's like technology feels like an inescapable doom scroll, and it makes me feel like farther away from people. And so, I mean, it's both. It's everything. And it's complicated, but.
So both of your books talk about how loneliness is felt and perceived differently by women. And can you talk about that?
Yeah, Natalie, you want to start?
Sure. Yeah, in my introduction, I kind of touch on the book. The Lonely Stories does encompass more stories from women than men, and I was fine with how that worked out. It was sort of, it happened in a sense by chance, but I think it felt right to me, because I feel like, you know, our society so often expects women to be the one to kind of hold everything together socially and emotionally. And then, you know, the women who relish being alone are, you know, the misfits and the witches, and, you know, what might be perceived as kind of, you know, rugged individualism in a male, and a female, in a woman could have, you know, a whiff of deviance or failure. And yeah, I mean, there are a number of essays that actually touch on this in different ways. The first one that comes to mind is Megan Giddings. She has the first essay in the book, but she talks about her experience, her discomfort, you know, being alone in public, particularly as a Black woman, and tells the story of the first time that, you know, she's able to see a movie alone, and how empowering it actually is when she can choose to be alone, as opposed to feeling like loneliness. Being alone as a woman is sort of treacherous and unsafe. Actually, can I read just a line, or is that okay? Just a short paragraph. There's this part. I feel like she says it better than I just did. So for clarity, for Megan Giddings, she says, "So often women are conditioned to be people pleasers, to be the ones who keep things smooth and pleasant for everyone around them. I tell women to do these things for themselves, because worrying so much about other people can smother the risk-taking part of your brain that writing needs. It's a small thing, but in the dark theater, I learned that I didn't need to look at someone else's face lit by a screen to understand how to feel. My emotions are valid. Sometimes I can simply look into myself to know the world around me." And that's her story of seeing a movie alone for the first time. Yeah, I'm interested to hear what Kristen.
I love that passage. Yeah, I mean, I was interested in, I think when in the book, one of the things I was interested in was like representations of gender and loneliness in media. And I mean, it's a limited, there's a lot of flaws to that. One of those is that media representations tend to be pretty binary in terms of gender. So, and certainly in scientific studies, there's studies about how women experience loneliness, how men experience loneliness, but not that reflects, you know, a more accurate survey of what gender actually is. But you know, I think similar to what Natalie mentioned, like women in the media who are portrayed as lonely are often portrayed as like spinsters, or you know, there's like something kind of pathetic or sad about it. And with men, I write a lot about cowboys in the book. There's kind of a like sexy gravitas that women don't usually get when they're lonely, unless they're like very dangerous women, like maybe she's an assassin, like literally. I think like there's like a couple of examples where that's not the case, where like the cowboy narrative is uprooted with a female narrator, but they're quite, or with a female in protagonist, but they're quite rare. And then also like men and women historically do create relationships in a different way and maintain relationships in a different way. Women are much more likely to continue developing relationships throughout their life, and men tend to make friendships early and then stop. And so over time, as those relationships fall away, their circles tend to get smaller.
I think we have time for one more question before Q&A. We'll open it up to the audience. So both of your books touch on types of loneliness that are rarely discussed or maybe overlooked. Can you share an image or passage from your book that sheds light on a less discussed aspect of loneliness and describe it?
Oh, that's hard.
Yeah.
Natalie, go first.
I mean, the first thing that comes to mind, I don't know if this is the best answer, but the first thing that comes to mind is the loneliness of shame, and of like being shamed and or even embarrassed, because I feel like all of these can actually kind of be experienced as kind of loneliness. And that's actually, that feeling of shame and embarrassment comes up a bunch of times throughout the book, now that I'm thinking about it. But did you say you wanted me to, or you wanted us to
just
reference an example?
describing it, yeah.
Yeah, something that
the shame one. I immediately think of that Star Trek convention.
I thought of that, and I thought of Maggie Shipstead for some reason when she's diving in the Maldives,
right.
and she gets decompression sickness. And because I remember her when we were emailing about this, that was the first one that came to mind, because I remember she was emailing, and she actually, I hope it's okay with her that I'm telling you this, but but she had some nervousness, some qualms about contributing to this book. But she felt like because she had those qualms, that was a sign she needed to contribute, which I thought was just the best thing ever. But I think she had some sort of like embarrassment about the embarrassment, which I can completely relate to. But she tells a story, she tells a bunch of stories, but one of them is this time that she got decompression sickness, which when she was scuba diving on a travel writing assignment. And decompression sickness can be fatal. And she has this horrible, like crippling pain, and the head diver on her boat just doesn't believe her. And he's like, well, I mean, you might think that's what it is, but you're totally wrong. And you do whatever you want to do, it, insinuating that she's being pathetic. And she describes herself. She says she feels like she's a child again, and coming up with an excuse to get out of PE. And she's just sort of like burning with loneliness, because it's sort of that recognition that ultimately, like, you can't like show someone else the inside of your body, and you can't just like open it up and be like, look, you're wrong. And I mean, I feel like to me, that's, I don't know, I was someone who, I was sick a lot as a child, and that was part of my motivation for writing this, because I was lonely a lot since I was in bed with my sickness. But it wasn't something that was always external. It was more, it wasn't something visible. And so I really relate to that feeling of loneliness, in the body, and the shame of not being able to show it or prove it. And I don't know, she writes, she knew that she knew she was right and the doctor was wrong, but that didn't stop her from feeling ashamed and embarrassed and lonely. I feel like most people have probably experienced some permutation of that.
Yeah, for sure.
Life. Yeah.
One of the things in researching the book, I mean, a lot of things surprised me about the study of loneliness. There were a lot of things I didn't realize before I started, and that's what I love about writing nonfiction. Is, I mean, for me, the research is the best part. It's also like the time you can get really out of your own brain and be taught by a lot of different people. But one of the things that really surprised me was that loneliness is actually contagious, because when we're lonely, we tend to isolate even more. We tend to self-isolate, and we tend to assume that we'll be rejected before we've actually been rejected. So we stop reaching out. So you might be like, well, I'm not going to call Win because Win doesn't want to hang out with me anyway, and I'll just stay home. And then Win's like, well, I guess Kristen doesn't want to hang out with me. This sucks. And then like Win will be like, well, I'm not going to call Natalie then because no one likes me. And then Natalie will be like, man, none of my friends are calling me. And it kind of, so actually it can radiate out to up to 3 degrees removed. And this is like a scientific fact. And so the thing that I think for me is the most important thing that I learned from that book is that we have to fight that impulse when we feel alone to insulate more. You kind of have to fight past that sense of discomfort and put yourself out there, as cheesy and cliche as that might sound.
Because the antidote is to seek connection, right?
Yeah. And I think like one of the frustrating and difficult things about loneliness is like, just because you go hang out with a friend doesn't mean it solves the loneliness problem. But the more opportunity, the more times we put ourselves in those positions, the better the chances that we're going to have, you know, a meaningful connection or a meaningful conversation.
Right. Okay, so I think, Aditya, are we ready for the Q&A part?
Yes, we are all ready. I put this in the chat, but for anyone who didn't see it, we're now in the Q&A portion. So if you have any questions for our lovely authors, feel free to ask them now. There's two ways you can do that. You can either type it into the chat, where we'll see it and I'll read it as well. Or you may also use the raise hand function, and that is going to be found in the reactions button in the bottom toolbar of your Zoom screen. You'll probably see a little smiley face. If you click on that, you'll also see a button that says raise hand. Just wait for me to call on you, and then you can definitely ask it on the mic live if you'd like to do that as well.
Okay, please don't be shy.
We have a question from Sylvia.
Hi. Thank you guys. Thank you all for that. I was kind of wondering about, I know one of my colleagues was working on a fictional book about a pandemic when like sort of for a long time before the pandemic broke out, but then like was in the midst of it. And that was, I remember she was talking about how that was like a very difficult sort of experience and kind of too close to home sometimes. And it does sound like the process of working on these projects was much more positive for you two. But I was just curious if there were any moments where like you felt that where you struggled at all with creating these things, examining this topic in the midst of this experience of the pandemic, or like sort of like those feelings where sometimes you're too close to something to sort of talk about it just yet or write about it.
I mean, for me, definitely. And I'll say that it didn't even necessarily have to do with the pandemic. I mean, like writing is like hard and often terrible. And I feel like we don't talk about that enough, that most of it is like feels embarrassing and stupid, and you're saying the wrong things, and you're sitting down at your computer and just not writing. You can't figure it out. Like the majority of my writing life is not particularly pleasurable. What I stick with it for is because like the times when it works, it feels like a miracle, but those things happen so rarely, and you kind of have to trust that it's gonna come. But I think for me, so I wouldn't necessarily call it a positive experience, but I will say that writing the book did make me feel, it changed my relationship to loneliness. I mean, I'm a less lonely person than I was since when I started writing the book, because I understand loneliness better. And for me, that's the most important part of moving through something is looking at it from a lot of different angles and from a lot of different perspectives. And I think it takes away some of its power when I understand kind of why I'm feeling the way I'm feeling.
For me, I mean, I agree with a lot of what you were saying. I feel like actually even for coming up with a proposal to selling it to pitching writers to
terrible.
Pitching all these proposals are terrible, and then selling it, and then pitching each writer and trying to woo them, to the project, which in some cases was easy, but often not really, and trying to, offer ideas that I would think might be up their alley, and then even actually editing. I don't know, I'm the kind of person that immediately, I read something and then I panic that I'm not going to know,
Yeah.
how to get it where it needs to be. And this like anxiety floods me. And then I, can't do anything else until I've figured it out. And for better or for worse, that's always how I work. That's how I work when I'm painting. And that's how I work when I'm editing. It's always this like flooding panic. And then,
Totally.
You dive in and try and ignore it. And then eventually I suddenly get it. It's like the glowing light and, you get there, but it's a process. So, I mean, and then also I think making it during the pandemic, although that did make it less lonely for me in some ways, having these relationships, it also, it was a pandemic still. So, it was definitely a really hard time to kind of summon faith in, the idea even that there are books to write and paintings to paint and, people who care about it all and, joy to still be summoned. I mean, it mattered. And when it came together, it made it feel, like you said, especially profound when, then beauty and wisdom would kind of come out of all of this really, really difficult time. So yeah, I feel similarly.
I think an important thing for me is to realize that we all feel like we don't know what we're doing. And that's because we don't totally know what we're doing, and that's okay. Like, you don't know how to write a book until you're done writing it. Like, you teach yourself how to do it while you're doing it. That's the same thing with a sentence or a story or anything. Like, I don't know how to write the book I'm writing right now, but I'm figuring it out. And that's writing is just kind of muddling through. And it doesn't mean you don't take a million wrong turns. And that's fine too. That's part of the process. You're getting smarter in the process. And I think sometimes if the few people I know who, well, this is mean, but the few writers I know who think they have it all figured out are the writers I really am not interested in reading. But, so I think you're on the right track if you're not sure.
Thank you.
Oh, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt if you were still going. I'm just going to go to the next question. So we have a question from Gordon in the chat. Hi, everyone. In researching and putting your books together, was there a general theme that arose that you can discern in how to cope or overcome or to engage with loneliness?
I mean, for me, I think this is the hardest question that I get because I don't have a good answer, because loneliness is so complicated and it's so difficult to overcome. And the answer is different for everyone. So I really don't have a good solution there. I mean, I think part of my advice is to be patient with yourself because it takes time to and you can't just like I said earlier, you can't just be like, sure, I'll just go to this party and then I won't be lonely anymore. That's not how it works. Like, it really does take time, and it's about finding your people and also a lifestyle that allows you to really engage with those people, which is very tricky in a capitalist world where we have a lot of commitments. So it's really hard. I think also and I think one of the things I was surprised to learn when I was writing the book was that everyone has a different biological threshold for how much loneliness they feel. So there's nothing we can do to change that. Some of us feel a lot lonelier than others, and so I think for me, accepting that this is something like inherent and biological, and there's a biological reason that we feel lonely, because we feel loneliness like a physical threat, because throughout most of human history, it was. If you were like alone when we were in our caveman days, that was super dangerous. You might starve to death or get eaten by a tiger. Like, you had to be around other people in order to survive. So sometimes when we feel lonely now, it's that same sort of caveman brain, like bubbling up, being like, you're in danger, you're in danger. And in some ways we are, but not in the same way as we were then. Like, our brains just haven't caught up. And now when we live in a world where we do spend a lot of time alone, or maybe we're alone for our jobs, or maybe we're isolated taking care of children, there's a million reasons why we're in that state a lot. So I think part of it is about like being patient with yourself and understanding that Natalie talked a lot about shame earlier, which I love, because I think shame is a big part of loneliness, because you feel like there's something wrong with you. And there's not. I mean, loneliness is a biological response.
Just like hearing that said is somehow so comforting. Hearing you say it, I was like, thank you. I feel better now. I do think that hearing other people say these things, or reading it in your book is very unlonely to to remember. And that was part of my motivation for, I mean, there were a lot of different reasons, but that was part of my motivation for making this book, that the book would feel cathartic and unlonely, and kind of remind people that we're not as alone as we think we are, and or at least we're not alone in feeling lonely.
Yeah,
which is different, I guess. But I mean, both. And I said in my intro that maybe it reminds us to handle our aloneness with tenderness, and I stand by that. I mean, that's something I have to remind myself too. So I'm kind of reading my own sentence for myself, because I still feel it, as we all do. I don't think any of us are immune. But yeah, as for like coping mechanisms for loneliness, I mean, there isn't one like overarching thing in the book really, but there are definitely things that come up. Some of the things that, there's a lot of walking alone, there's going to the movies alone, dining alone, kayaking alone. Nature definitely comes up a bunch. Reading alone, travel, taking a warm bath, children's laughter. I think a lot of it is like, and all of that sounds amazing to me, and I'll take one of each right now. But I think that, for me, the things that offer the greatest relief for loneliness are the things that like bring me into the moment and kind of remind me of my senses. I don't know, I'm just saying for me personally, like I think being grounded in the senses is sort of key for me.
Yeah.
And
I mean,
like,
we also, sorry,
no,
go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, just being like, it reminds me, I think, that I'm still here, and that's a refrain throughout the book. But Anthony Doerr's essay is called "Am I Still Here?" And then Jesmyn Ward has this echo, "We're here," and it's something I mentioned in my intro. Like, I say, "I'm still here," because it ties into this imagery of when I was a child. But anyhow, I'm sorry, I don't want to cut you off.
Oh no, I was cutting you off. And I wasn't going to say anything really that interesting, other than that loneliness can be really situational. Like when I was doing interviews for this book, a lot of people talked about their loneliest moments being moments of transition, like when they were when they had a baby, when they moved to a new place, when they went through a divorce, when they retired, when someone they loved died. Like there are all these things where suddenly you have to readjust what you think your life is, or what you really have to readjust how you live your life, which is an incredibly destabilizing experience. And so I think part of it is about giving that some space, which is agonizing. I mean, it's like really, I think one of the worst things that we can go through in our life cycles is sort of those gaps in our lives where we're trying to reacclimate.
Yeah.
I knew this hour would go by like that.
And I just ended us on such a cheery note.
So I just want to thank you guys both for being here, having this conversation with me. And I think, these books really they made me feel a lot less lonely. And so I'm really grateful for that and for this conversation. Quick plug, please purchase CQ and The Lonely Stories, which is forthcoming. It's coming out April 19th, right, Natalie?
That's right. Yeah, thank you.
You can purchase them at our partner Ivy Bookshop in Baltimore or at your local independent bookstore.
Well, this has been a wonderful conversation. You talked about loneliness in a way that actually I have not heard. I learned a few things, and I'm sure everybody in this room did. But can you guys take yourselves off mute just for a minute and just give a thanks to Kristen Radke and Natalie Eve Garrett and Nguyên Khôi Nguyễn. Thank you for this.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank
I want
you.
to thank once again our partners. I want to thank everybody in the room for just showing up and for helping us get this festival launched. We have a month of activities planned ahead. Please visit CityLit Project. Please, by all means, fill out an evaluation. We want to know what you want, what you need for literature. One reason why we have a graphic author here is because you said you wanted it. And so look, we brought you what
Thanks,
you
y'all.
Absolutely. So your evaluations are important. There's a QR code that you can use or an evaluation form that you can just fill out. But we really, really, really need to hear from you. Our funders want to hear from you. So as long as you fill something out, we might get a little bit of money to continue doing this good work. But thank you so much for these two incredible artists. Thank you, Nguyên. You were wonderful. We're going to take maybe a minute break so Kristen can get ready for this next section. If you're a writer, you're fine. Okay, if you're a writer, please hang out with us. So this is the portion, we introduced the writer's room last year during the pandemic, during a virtual meeting, and realized that writers wanted to connect with other writers. And each time we did it, we found that the featured authors were as excited about the process as the writers in the room. So we hope you, one, turn on your cameras so we can see you. And I'll have Kristen just take it away. Now's the time just to be one with these wonderful artists. So thank you.
Cool. So I can talk a little bit about how I started doing this work. So I was always writing and I was always drawing, and it took me a long time to figure out you could do them at the same time. And my first book went out, I don't know, in 2015 to publishers, and got a lot of nice rejections, and felt sad for a while. And then my editor for my first book, the late Dan Frank, who we lost during the pandemic, but who was a wonderful, brilliant editor, he wrote this letter to my agent and was like, I'm really interested in what Kristen's exploring. Does she want to come talk to me about it? I think I have some ideas or whatever. And so I remember clearing my whole day. I was in my late 20s, and I was like, I'm going to go meet this editor. And then, the meeting lasted 6 minutes, and he was like, okay, great. Thanks. Goodbye. And it was, really important 6 minutes, because he saw the book in a way that I never did before. And I, at that point, basically rewrote the entire book. We signed the contract halfway through that process, I think. And then I started writing CQ before the pandemic, before I realized how lonely we were all about to become. And during the pandemic, I have my day job, I should say. I'm an art director. It's hard to, as everyone in this room probably knows, it's hard to juggle a job and a creative life. But it's also, because my job is also creative, it feels like a real gift. And I try to remind myself of that when I'm getting Slack messages late at night. And during the pandemic, I wrote and drew an entire graphic novel and then threw it away. And I'm working on a different book now, and I'm still feeling a little bit of grief about that, but also proud that I walked away from something I didn't, that didn't feel like it was serving me anymore. And that has been a difficult but surprising lesson for me, I think, during this time. I didn't, to have spent all that time and to trust that it was in service of something, even if I don't want anyone to ever see what I made. And that brings me up, I guess, to today. I'm working on a book now about, I think CQ is about isolation, and I'm working on a book now about connection and about gossip, actually, and how we communicate interpersonally, and how gossip can be a tool for good, and it doesn't have to be about saying nasty things. It can actually just be about sharing information about our social worlds, which is how we understand who we are and where we belong. It's also a way we can fight power, and because language belongs to everyone, and talk can't be checked in the same way, even though throughout history there's been a lot of lot of effort in to this day put into silencing people. And sometimes squashing gossip was about that as well. So that's me. I hope that was helpful, or not at least agonizingly boring.
Oh, that was helpful. And the idea that gossip can be, I mean, who doesn't want a little bit of it, right?
I know. So there's actually like the stats on it are that only 15% of gossip is negative, and that the rest of it is either neutral or positive. So I try to 15%, yeah, but that humans spend up to 65% of their day on what is technically gossip, which is funny because how many people do you know who are like, I never gossip, I would never gossip, which is, you know, I talked to an expert yesterday, and I said, like, what do you say when people say that? And he's like, I tell them that they're wrong because everyone gossips. So
everybody wants the goods.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, audience, you have a writer in the room. Come on, let's chat it up, talk. Because I can keep going.
I have a question.
Cool.
Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. So maybe this is sort of a general question, but I'm curious how it feels like putting a book or a project that you've worked on for a long time out into the world. I guess I'm asking because like I recently put out like a personal project, and I have a background as an artist, and like so I kind of went through a long period where I wasn't making anything and producing anything or even sharing anything on social media, and then like just recently I put something out, and I felt like all this post-release like shame and embarrassment for having shared anything of myself. And I'm just wondering if that is something that ever comes up to you, for you.
Why do you think you felt that?
I don't know, because also I like my day job is like writing for a publication, so I am always sharing my work, but I think it was the personal, just the personal vulnerable kind of content maybe.
Yeah. I mean, I relate to that a lot. I think probably most writers do. I mean, I think putting something out into the world feels terrible and also wonderful. And like, it depends on the moment. And sometimes it's both of them at once. I mean, it can feel it's really hard. I mean, it's very, and I think one of the things that's helped me now is like understanding that once I put something into the world, it's not mine anymore. And people can respond to it however they want. And it, like at a certain point, doesn't really have even anything to do with me anymore. Like it's in conversation now with somebody else. Like everyone who reads it is having a different experience, and they're bringing to it their own life and mind and experiences and ways of thinking. And that's like kind of extraordinary. Like what a gift that someone in this short and precious life is spending a little time with something you write. And that's the hope. I mean, if even one person does that in a certain way, it was kind of worth it. But I think in general, writing or creating art at all is just sort of about getting a little more comfortable with humiliation, because it all feels so embarrassing. I mean, it feels like in these, you know, there's always something that seems more important, or there's something you could have done better, or am I the right person to tell this, or could someone else have told it better? Or I mean, there's so many things to feel doubt about. But I also think that's sometimes just a symptom of it mattering and it being important. I mean, there's nothing to feel shame about if you don't really care about it. So I don't know. I mean, I think shame is one of the most destructive things we can feel, and I'm always trying to fight against it. But it's I definitely do not always succeed. I'm starting, actually, my friend and I, the wonderful poet Jenny Johnson, are starting a shame book club of just the two of us who are reading books about shame. So I relate very much to what you're saying.
That's awesome. Thank you.
Actually, to one more thing about that, the poet Carl Phillips has a line that says, "What is shame but having shown?" And I think that's just perfect. And that's exactly what you did. You showed by sharing personal work. So I think it's just, it's such a vulnerable thing.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Anyone else? So Kristen, so talking about loneliness is, really making yourself vulnerable because, you're just kind of opening yourself up to an emotion that people don't readily admit, right?
Totally.
So, how did you deal with people around you knowing that you were navigating
Lonely.
that subject? Yeah, because that probably had to be a little bit of awakening for them.
It was weird because at first I never felt like I was just like loneliness. It's this totally normal thing. Like, and then after a while, like when I was writing it, I started getting kind of different reactions or people being like, it must be so strange to kind of admit that or something. And then it was really not until it was filtered through other people that I started to feel that kind of self-consciousness early on, which is interesting because usually no one else can make me feel as ashamed or self-conscious as I myself am capable of, which I think is true for a lot of us when we're our most difficult critics. But I think what was surprising to me about the project was that in terms of my personal relationships was that, most people that I love and am close to disclosed to me their own loneliness and realizing that we were all kind of, the book is dedicated to my dad who has been really open with me about his loneliness the last couple of years. And I'm so much closer to him because of it, because we've been able to share that. So I think in general, I feel amazed and very grateful that as I've shared this vulnerable, difficult thing, that other people have really risen to the occasion and done the same thing.
Yeah, I think you're onto something there too, because when you're around someone and they open up in that way, it's almost like you want to be with them. You want to just sit in that
Totally
space with them. So it changes the whole dynamic of things.
Yeah, you're totally right. I mean, there's this thing of, when someone, like you're just getting to know someone and someone like discloses something to you or shares something kind of vulnerable or embarrassing or something, and you feel that you want to meet them there and you want to tell them something just as vulnerable because you don't want to like leave them on the ledge by themselves because it's such a vulnerable thing to do.
Right.
And so you find yourself like all of a sudden it's like someone says something really intimate and then you do the same thing, and then all of a sudden you're in this conversation you couldn't have imagined that you had when you showed up to this party or wherever in the before times when we used to get to do things like that. So I don't know. I think the meeting people where they are is the core of human relationships. I think is an empathy.
Yes, that word.
Well, and I think the other thing you realize is that if you hadn't shared it, think how much you would have lost.
Totally.
You wouldn't have known that person and you wouldn't have had the affirmation of your own emotions.
Yeah.
There's just so much that was lost. It's lost when we don't take that risk to be vulnerable.
Yeah, totally. And I think like one of the things I'm looking for as a writer, as an artist, as a person is like to know that I'm not alone in my experience. And whether that's sharing something and having someone say, I see you, or I understand how you feel, or being someone else saying, that happened to me too, or I also feel that way. It's like, as long as someone's taking the effort. And I think that's what goes back to when I was talking about the gift of someone reading your work. It's like someone's meeting you where you are and meeting your work, and engaging with it. And that's just like such a gift. And that's what I try to do as a reader too. I try to be generous in that way. I think it's actually something, it's March, I guess it's a little late for resolution, but maybe I'll make it a resolution to try to be a more active and engaged reader, like reaching out to people when I like something that they've done or things like that. I mean, I think those things can just make such a difference.
Absolutely. I think Tracy had a question.
Yeah, and I've been trying to like formulate exactly how I want to say it, because like what Rebecca asked kind of spurred it, and this conversation about vulnerability that we're having just has me really thinking and like wondering, and especially because as a writer, I feel like a lot of what I write is like about feeling angry about being vulnerable. So I was wondering if as you're writing, you found any like intersections of like being vulnerable and alleviating loneliness, or like maybe because of how something's received, like it could just exacerbate it. Like did you find anything like exploring that?
Can you say more about that? I just want to make sure I answer it in the right way.
Yeah, I mean, I'm trying to figure out what I'm asking. Like, it just seems like there's such a an intersection between being vulnerable or not and the loneliness someone might feel.
That's interesting. I mean, I think that like we can't feel, we will never not feel lonely if we're not being vulnerable. Like, I think that's really the difficult thing about loneliness, is that we have to expose ourselves in order to have connection. Like, you can't be composed all the time and not share, you know, the dark parts of yourself or the difficult parts and feel connected, because that's not what intimacy is. And I think it's like that with writing too. Like, we have to put it out there. I think like one of the things a lot of people ask, like particularly when I teach, a lot of people are like, how do I like feel brave enough to put something difficult out there, or how do I publish a thing? And the thing I always remind myself and other people when I'm in working is that like there's a big difference between writing and publishing. And you can write something and maybe it's not as scary as it felt, as it seemed. Like my fear about our being afraid to put things out there is that it stops us from writing in the first place. And it's like, you can make a decision, like put that decision about whether or not you're going to put it in the world, like put that further away when you're writing. Like when you're writing, it should just get whatever out that you want to get out, and whatever you want to say or whatever you're afraid to say. You don't have to show it to anyone. But I think more often than not, once you see it on the page and you work with it and you live with it and you figure it out, you're going to want to put it out there. And it sort of takes away its power in a certain way, but it also makes it and you more powerful. And I'm getting a little convoluted here, but hopefully you know what I mean. Like, I think it's about like breaking down those steps and kind of like allowing yourself space to sit in that discomfort without thinking about like the end result all at once. Is that at all what you were asking? I'm sorry if I'm not answering it well.
Yeah, I think that's part of it. And I can see like a writing thing I did last month. I asked my workshop group, like if a piece I brought to them was a potential essay or like should just be a journal entry. Like,
interesting.
Where it's like, where did that want to be with like the level of vulnerability I was feeling bringing it to them.
Interesting. What did they say?
They had a surprising amount of positive things to say. So I was like, okay, I'm going to see where this goes.
Yeah, that's awesome.
Well, the thing I liked what you said, Kristen, and I really firmly believe this, write the scariest thing to me.
Yeah.
Write the thing that you're most afraid of, that you don't like want to talk about. You just write it and see where it takes you. Because inevitably, I think you'll realize that there was power in one, writing it, and two, the idea of releasing it.
Totally. And then understanding it better. Like you can work through it if you put it on the page. I mean, like anyone who's in this room is here because you're a writer, which means you think through. You can think, there's a way to think through something that you put on the page that you can't if you just keep it in your mind. So it's, there's also just regardless of whether you're going to publish it or not, regardless of the art or the craft of it, there's also like, I think a real benefit to you as a person to sort of just like spit it out in that way. Exactly what you're saying, Carla.
Absolutely. So Laura, you want to ask a question?
Yes. In the writing of the book, did you discover anything that surprised you about solitude, as in positive experiences of solitude, or the way people confuse solitude and loneliness?
It's a great question. I think surprising. I mean, I think one of the things I came to understand is, I mentioned this earlier, but that everyone has a different sort of tolerance for how much solitude and also loneliness they can tolerate, or how often solitude dips into loneliness. I think like I'm not always very tolerant of solitude historically, but I find that I'm less tolerant of it when I'm bored. Like it's hard for me to feel lonely if I'm not bored. If I'm really engaged or interested in what I'm doing, I'm fulfilled. And so I think it's about separating, like the fulfillment factor is what I think about a lot. It's like, if I'm really interested in what I'm doing, I never feel lonelier than when I don't know what I'm doing in my project, or when I feel like I've had a bad writing day, or like I feel like an idiot, or so it's like I can't always find solace in my work. Like I just can't, because some days it's very bad, or I don't know where I'm going. And so then I try to seek out, connection elsewhere through books, or movies, or talking to someone that I care about and getting kind of fulfillment there. But then also, if the work is feeding me, I try to be fed by it. And I think that has a lot to do with, and certainly it doesn't even feel like solitude anymore, because you're in a conversation, even if it's just with yourself.
Mm-hmm. I find it interesting that your next book is on connectedness, or connecting, because how we connect is so different. Some people connect just by being in the same room together.
Totally.
Not saying words. Some people connect by doing having a shared experience. Yeah. What are you finding that's surprising you about that whole notion of how we connect?
I think what I'm really interested in terms of connection is conversation, and how we and communication. And so one of the things that has been shocking to me about that research is that the way that we talk to each other has actually, from everything that linguists and sociologists can deduce, has not changed throughout the course of human history. So although our vocabularies have changed, our languages have changed, the level of formality has changed, certain things like the way that we take turns when we talk, the way that we signal to one another that we're done and it's someone else's turn, the way that we nod along and give each other reinforcement as we go, is something deeply rooted in who we are. It's it's really what makes us human beings. And so I think that's really beautiful and amazing. And I'm trying to think about how we can best utilize that and think about things that we consider flaws in language. Like if I use the word like too often, which I do, if I use the word too often, which I do, I like to think about those as just sort of assistance in communication, because that's what they are. Gives you a chance to formulate your thought, and it tells the other person, I know I'm stalling, but I'm not done yet. Give me a sec, I'm figuring it out. And we have these little phrases, or these little tics that tell us something about each other, and kind of tell us about our mindset. So I don't know, I think that's really beautiful. So I've been trying to be, and after I've been doing the research, I'm also way more interested in hearing how people talk. I just want to, it's not even about, of course I'm interested in the content of what they're saying, but I also just love overhearing people and how they construct their sentences, and kind of how they defer to one another. I just think it's really amazing.
Absolutely. I also think as a writer, I'm always interested in talking to older, and I say that being elder, but but talking to older people, you get some really, it's just a fascinating thing to just listen and to the stories told and what's not told, the untold story behind the conversation. But I think that it's a wonderful topic. Ryan, you have a question?
Yeah, or maybe just some thoughts. Hello, maybe just some thoughts to add. This has been such an interesting conversation. I think a lot about loneliness and solitude, and how we're so primed to think of movements in one direction, maybe loneliness to solitude is the direction, but it's really more of a cyclical exchange of the two, moving from loneliness to solitude and back and forth between them. And then the other thing I was really just thinking about was what you said, one thing about even if you're only having a conversation with yourself, that perhaps art helps you get in touch with that. And so I was just kind of thinking of art as communication. And then I was thinking of how this society is structured for loneliness. And so even the fact of writing for yourself, just so that you can feel some kind of solitude or connection with yourself, that the act of writing helps you reconnect with yourself, which then may help you realize how to then reconnect with other people. Totally. But the point is that this has been taken away from us. It's been commodified as something to be sold back to us, and it's not. Even publishing is the commodified version of art. And so it can be a part of what our goal should be. It should definitely be, because that validation and that recognition is awesome.
And it's also a form of sharing.
Definitely, and it's a way of, on a huge scale that you can't do. You can't just produce on your own social media or
Right.
your community, for example. So this has been such an interesting conversation. It's given me so much to think about, and I would be interested to hear your thoughts on like just how loneliness is built into our society.
Definitely. Yes, you're absolutely right. Particularly, in America. I mean, America is not the loneliest country in the world statistically, but it is definitely top 5. And so Hannah Arendt has this quote in her book, The Origins of Totalitarianism, that says, isolated men are powerless by definition. And it's all about how totalitarian regimes try to isolate people from one another because we're less powerful when we're by ourselves. And we don't have someone to check in with and to reinforce, like, hey, this is kind of messed up, right? Like, and someone will be like, yeah. And someone will be like, hey, we should do something about this. And someone's like, yeah. Which is also why historically gossip has been squashed so much. Like, union busting is a way of, all of those things. It's about, don't talk to your coworker about working conditions or about how much they make. Like, all of those things. It's about keeping us separate from one another because we're weaker. So like structures of power have a lot to gain by keeping us separate from one another. You're absolutely right. I couldn't agree more.
Well, and that thought that you just said made me think of something, because I remember being taught in elementary school when we were being taught about group work and group projects that when you, I think, I hate that this is being recorded because I might be wrong on my literary reference. But I think it was a reference to Tom Sawyer about whitewashing a fence, and about how if you wanted the task to get done more quickly, you had to separate the two friends as opposed to have the two friends work together. And the experiences of my lifetime have showed me exactly the opposite to be true. But for so long in my mind, that was something that was embedded in elementary school. And for so long in my mind, working with friends, I was like, man, this is so distracting, friend. You got to get away from me. And then in my adult life, the older I get, I realize having a friend sitting next to me, no matter what I'm doing, even if I'm being lonely, is the best thing in the world, I
totally agree. I know people who started like Zoom groups where they would just log on for an hour a week and just like write together, with everybody on mute, just to feel that sense of community, which I think is so cool.
So Kristen, we have only a couple more minutes.
Yeah.
What would you say to these writers in the room in terms of navigating the publishing world? Like, what stands out for you as the thing that they should be mindful of?
I think that there's no one way to do it. Like, I remember going to readings when I was a student and hearing someone explain the process of like how they got published or how they write, or someone would be like, I get up at 5 a.m. every day to write. And I'd be like, well, I can't get up at 5 a.m. I'm a zombie. I'm never gonna be a writer. And like, I would hear somebody tell their story, and if I couldn't see myself in it, I was certain that I couldn't do it. And so there's so many ways to reach where you want to go. And so I think understanding that like it might not be the same linear path of someone you admire, and that's your path is just as valuable. I think that I still try to remind myself of that, and things happen out of order, and things happen in like at weird times in your life, or inconvenient times, or later than you want, or earlier than you want. And so I think like just kind of being open to possibility and really, like, it's like cheesy, but it is about putting yourself out there, and it's about like going after opportunities and doing it again and again and again, and sending a million emails and pitching like crazy, and not being embarrassed, talking about shame earlier, not feeling ashamed when it doesn't work out, because it's just, rejection means absolutely nothing. It is not, it truly, like, there's nothing that means less than rejection, because it's hit somebody's inbox on the wrong day, or they don't ever look at it, or they hate flowers and you're writing about flowers, or they hate pictures and you're drawing pictures. I mean, there's just so many reasons that something doesn't work, and for a certain publication or for a certain place, and that doesn't mean it's not going to be a fit for someplace else. So I think it's just about continuing to put yourself out there and listening to feedback from others. If you get a good rejection, a positive rejection, someone's like, thanks for sending this, but here's what I thought. Sit with it, think with it. Not all feedback is going to be right for you. Not every reader is going to be your reader, and you have to, over time, I think it's about learning to what to take in and what to let go. But I also being open to other people's readings of your work, I think is important, and not being resistant to that, because you can learn a lot.
Absolutely. I think I remember reading something about you at one point in time that said that you questioned whether or not you should write a graphic.
Definitely.
Book,
oh
that
yeah.
people were kind of discouraging you, and look at you now. I mean, really.
I mean, but I mean, like when I started writing a graphic book, I had no business writing a graphic book, but I taught myself how to do it as I went, and I taught myself by looking at models. I mean, other people taught me when I read their work over and over and over and over. And I really, that's like my biggest piece of advice, is just knowing that, like, when you sit down to do it and you feel like you can't do it, you're totally right, but you're going to teach yourself how to do it as you go. And it's just about sitting down and doing it again and again and again. And there's nothing wrong with not knowing, because you're going to figure it out.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for that. I remember Alice Walker at one point in time said that you have to kind of, you kind of have to live a little bit to write the good book, because you got to do some things. You got to get beaten up, and life's got to wear at you a little bit to write that story.
Totally.
But you've been amazing this evening.
Thank you
so much for just being vulnerable with us, for telling us your story, for just being with us in this room. I just thank you so much for just.
Oh, sorry, my power just went out in this room.
Hey, see.
I guess I gotta go.
Right timing though. Everybody just take off yourself off mute and thank Kristen, please, for being with us. We appreciate you.
Everybody. This was really
joyful
fun.
signers, we appreciate you. We appreciate
thank you so much. Thank you for being here.
Absolutely.
You've been a wonderful, joyful voice to talk about loneliness.
Yes.
Oh, good. I'm so glad.
Yes, but thank you so much.
Thank you, everybody.
Don't forget, writers in the room, fill out the evaluation. We want to hear from you. Thank you for joining us for tonight. You've been really just an incredible pleasure. Take care now.
Thank you all. Have a great night.
Thank you. Good night.
Thank you.